Welcome, Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Dan Morrison. I'm an assistant professor of sociology here at Seaver College. It was my privilege to help organize this afternoon's panel and set of conversations. As we get started, I want to tell you one very important thing. Silence your cell phones. Please, now. Because I'm about to lead a little prayer, and if Jesus hears your cell phone ring while the prayer is ongoing, he'll probably understand because he forgives. But the rest of us will be thrown off. So silence. Has everyone done that? Is that enough time? Okay, great. Please join me in prayer. Almighty God, you are in this place. You hear our cries. You know our suffering. You bless us with joy and companionship. Be with us as we enter into this time of learning and dialogue. We ask your grace and peace to accompany us this day. Together we say, Amen. Let me say a few words about what we have planned for the next 2 hours. In the first hour, we will hear from faculty and students who are up here in the first row. Each has prepared no more than 5 minutes of remarks. These remarks are intended to be trailers for the discussion and dialogue that will follow. I have asked each to focus on recent events in Ferguson, Missouri, and the lessons that they draw, both as scholars and as people of conscience. Tabitha Jones-Jolivet and I will keep time, and we will go in order from your left to right on the stage. I'll introduce the panelists in a second. Given our time constraints, please hold your comments and questions for the dialogue that is to follow in the second half of our event. Also, please hold your applause until all speakers have finished. After our last panelist, I will show a slide up here that assigns panelists to Plaza classrooms for the dialogue session. So you'll see another slide that says these people will be in this room and so forth. Dr. Emily Scott Lowe and Tabitha Jones-Jolivet will help us in these dialogue sessions. As with all big events on campus, we need to establish some ground rules for this session and the dialogue time. So the following guidelines ensure that we can have a productive plenary session and gracious dialogue. During the plenary session, I and the panelists expect that all of you will listen actively, respecting others as they speak from experience, and employ scholarly resources. Number 2, take note of your questions, your own feelings, and the discomfort that can accompany conversations about race in our country and in our local community. Save these for the dialogue sessions. Number 3, keep it civil by refraining from loud comments or outbursts. Number 4, remember the goal of this dialogue, to gain a deeper understanding of the perspectives that you and others bring to the complex set of issues we're going to talk about today. During the discussion groups, these same general rules apply. I've asked the faculty and the dialogue coordinators to help us in keeping those same guidelines as we talk together. What's really important in those dialogue sessions is that you participate fully to the best of your ability, that you share your own experience instead of invalidating the stories of others, and that you keep an open mind, understanding that sharing personal experiences brings risk and vulnerability. So I ask you to honor those who take that risk and be kind enough and brave enough to join them. With these expectations in mind, I want to move now to a few sociological points, and I'll introduce the panelists. As I do that, behind me on the PowerPoint, you'll see a timeline of events that I've reconstructed from the New York Times website, if all goes well. I'm not going to narrate these slides, but I want to make sure that everyone has at least some familiarity with the event. Since August 9th, we've seen an ongoing discussion within national and international media We've had a bit of that conversation here on our own campus. What we haven't seen is, or what hasn't been presented, is a discussion of the perspectives that people bring, the meaning that different groups make from the events in Ferguson and other killings. While there's significant variation within racial groups in our country on many issues, we can discern general patterns. Over time and through experience, whites, blacks, Asians, and Hispanics and other groups develop a perspective that is shared widely among their members. You can think of these shared perspectives as interpretive lenses that individuals and groups use to make sense of both rare and commonplace occurrences within their environments. These perspectives are important in making sense of everyday practices, such as the intensive policing that many of our fellow citizens, predominantly in communities of color, experience. Often groups disagree on the reality of a situation because they approach it from different and often incompatible perspectives. The result is conflicting meanings of the same event. Evidence for differences in perspective is reflected in national opinion polling. For example, the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press reports that 80% of black but only 37% of white respondents say that the Brown case raises important issues about race. In addition, over half of all white respondents have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in investigations in the shooting, while 18% of blacks have that level of confidence. Clearly, blacks and whites do not share the same general perspective on this case. We all have a role in understanding the perspectives that our fellow citizens bring to events in the St. Louis suburb and other communities. We can and should analyze what happened and what the events mean from sociological, psychological, religious, and political science viewpoints, as well as others. But we should also remember that the principles, the people who the shooting of Michael Brown immediately affected, including Brown himself, are human beings with names and with stories. I want us to keep in mind that we need to humanize everyone involved: Michael Brown, Officer Darren Wilson, Brown's family and friends and neighbors, the city of Ferguson, the county of St. Louis. We need to treat people in this dialogue as subjects and not objects. If we treat them as objects, they become less than people, less than fully human persons. So let's keep these thoughts in mind as we dialogue with each other later today. On our panel, we have a distinguished group of scholars and students. I don't have time to go into all the awards and accolades for each one, so I will just briefly mention their names and fields, and they'll go in this order as they take the microphone over there. We have on the panel Dr. Ira Jolivet, a professor of religion, Dr. Dan Caldwell, political science, Dr. Tomas Martinez, psychology, Melissa Hurtado, a student here at Seaver, Dr. Joel Fetzer, a political science professor, Dr. Ray Carr, religion, Dr. Brian Newman, political science, and Joshua Gray will be our last speaker. After they've all, as I said, after they've all spoken, I'll have a brief moment where we'll assign and show people where to go in the plaza classrooms, which are just behind you and to the left, or through this door over here and to the right. First, I'd like to introduce and welcome to the mic Dr. Ira Jolivet.
Thank you. Good evening. I grew up in a segregated part of Houston, Texas in the 50s and 60s. And I had my experiences with police officers, and I had guns pulled on me. And one particular incident, my father, I thought, was going to get shot, and I had to tell him, don't say anything, be quiet. And they finally just got in the car and left. So I'm quite disturbed to see these kind of incidents that keep happening, because that was 50 years ago. So I wanted to know, what is it that keeps driving these kinds of incidents? Why are they still happening when people tell us that things are getting better? And I know they're getting better. They're a whole lot better than they were when I was growing up. So I thought about it from a historical perspective, and this is kind of what I came up with, is that fear causes people to do some of these things. Fear is an irrational emotion that causes people to do some really brutal and violent things sometimes. I thought all the way back to something I learned in my Greek history about the Spartans in the 5th century BCE. The Spartans were the baddest dudes in the Aegean Sea. I mean, they tear you up, Jack. Yeah, they asked the Persians. They held off the Persians at the Thermopylae. Thousands of Persians, 300 Spartans. They could fight. But you know, one thing they were scared of. They were scared of this group of people that they had subjugated and made slaves called the Helots. They were scared to death because the Helots outnumbered the Spartans. And they were afraid that the Helots were going to rise up and overthrow them. And so they would do things like every year they beat every one of the Helots, each one of them every year. And if a Helot got out of line for anything, they would randomly kill some of these Helots just to keep them in line, to keep them afraid, because they were afraid that the Helots were going to overthrow them. And then you jump up 2,000 years in history, the American slavery of African people over here. In a lot of places in the South, slaves outnumbered the masters and the white people. And you know, it was brutal for the slave, but can you imagine all of those people living in fear that these slaves were going to rise up and rebel against them? And look at what they had to do, because they were afraid. They did a lot of very irrational, brutal things. They forbade people to gather in groups of over 2 or 3. They couldn't be caught out at dark, or they would be punished severely. All of these things happened because people were afraid that somebody was going to do something, rise up and overpower them, because they were oppressing them. And I think we see the same thing today. People are driven by fear. This is why we have these kind of incidents still perpetuated today. You say, well, things are better, and they are better. Things have changed, but people are still driven by fear. And when you heard when President Obama when he was running for president, you know, how people were afraid, and people were saying things like, oh, if he gets in the office, there goes our country. It used to be there goes our neighborhood, now it was there goes the country. And people were really afraid. And then when he was being reelected, they were afraid, and people were saying, oh, if they put in Obamacare, your grandmother's going to die. Or he's going to take our guns away from us. All of these kind of things. And so I think this keeps perpetuating this fear that people have. And I saw it evidenced in the church. Oh, they're taking over our church. We got to take back our country. We got to take back our church. We got to take back everything. They're going to rise up against us. And now people feel threats from the South and threats from the inside and from the outside. And people are afraid, and they do rational things like they shoot somebody because they claim that he stole some cigars. And let me tell you something. Nobody shot Kenneth Lay, and he stole millions and millions of dollars of people and ruined their retirements. Nobody shot, what was the guy, Bernie Madoff, stole millions and millions of dollars. And nobody said, and we say it's all right to shoot somebody because they stole some cigars. See, I want to explore in my session fear. And what does faith have to say about that? Thank you.
I want to first begin by thanking all of you for being here, whether you're here to get Convo credit or to find out more about this really important issue. I really appreciate, and I know all of us appreciate you being here this afternoon. And I also want to thank my friend and colleague, Dan Morrison. So if you'd join me in thanking him, because he's the one who organized this, came up with the idea, and implemented it. So Dan, many thanks to you. I want to just tell you a couple of stories, and then I want to end with a conclusion. First story, a young White House official was supposed to translate for Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet leader, when he was visiting Washington, D.C. So she went to the location where she was supposed to meet Gorbachev and President George H.W. Bush, and she was apprehended by the Secret Service and was taken away and couldn't translate for President Bush. This young woman, Condoleezza Rice. And she was only released from the Secret Service's control when President Bush intervened. Why? I think a lot of it had to do with her race. Now we can say, well, the problem of race is a problem of the South, like Washington, D.C., where Condi Rice was when she was apprehended, or it's a problem of Missouri, where Mike Brown was killed. But what about Los Angeles? What about Malibu? Well, Los Angeles. My oldest daughter was a public defender for the Los Angeles Public Defender's Office for 5 years. And she represented mostly Latino juveniles. And she would come home with these stories saying that the police had planted evidence, that they had lied on the witness stand, and so on and so forth. And quite frankly, I had a hard time believing her, because that had not been my experience with the police. But then the disclosures about the Ramparts station in Los Angeles came to light, which showed that many of the things that she had told me about were fact. They weren't made up or anything else. So we've got a problem not just in Washington, D.C., with the Secret Service apprehending Condi Rice, or in Ferguson, Missouri, with Mike Brown getting killed. We've got a problem in Los Angeles. But what about Malibu? Well, a former colleague of mine, African-American colleague named James Taylor, told me that when he would drive to work, he often would be stopped on Pacific Coast Highway by the police. And they would stop him, he thought, and I think accurately, because of his race, racial profiling. So he would present his ID, say that he was from Pepperdine University, and on one case, the police looked at it, threw it in the gutter, and said, "Have a nice day." So we've got a problem in Washington, we've got a problem in Ferguson, Missouri, we've got a problem in Los Angeles, we've got a problem in Malibu. Former senator from New Jersey, also a Rhodes Scholar and NBA basketball player, Bill Bradley, was asked the question once, what are the 3 biggest problems we have in the United States? And he said, number 1 is race, number 2 is race, number 3 is race. So I applaud your decision to be here to address the biggest problem we have in the country, in my view, and that of Senator Bradley's. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here. I'm talking from a psychological perspective as a cross-cultural psychologist. And we've been having these discussions in my class, especially around the perception of safety and threat. And one of the things I guess I'm reminded of this week, especially even on this campus, if you think about it, we're all reminded of the potentials of danger, the potentials of risk, and the potentials of threat within ourselves, within our communities, within our nation. If you just look at the flags floating in the front of our campus here, it tells you not only about the courage that people had to face, but it reminds us of the potential threat that exists. And so to some extent, we've generalized that threat in the communities that I work in beyond this. And yet from Pepperdine, we're very safe and sheltered. If we think about the threat we perceive here, perhaps maybe the greatest threat is that of the weather in the context of how we live here every day. So the experiences of Mike Brown and the community are not unusual, are not something that only happens once in a while, but really happens to those that are less privileged, those that do not have a choice of where they can live or where they can work, and must survive in places that are not safe and in fact dangerous and threatening to their living world. Only when the spotlight in the media is put on this community are we made aware of these details and this history. Only when we're forced to look at places like Ferguson do we realize the risks and dangers that people survive in. I've worked with both ends of this problem and issue, not only with race in the inner cities and the community with many populations, but with the police and law enforcement. They're also victims of our own cultural racism and prejudice historically within our self-conscious. We all have these automatic tapes that play with us, that remind us of what we've been told all our lives. Some of them relevant, some of them irrelevant, some of them based on prejudice and history that we've all grown up with a certain level of consciousness and even unawareness. The good news is that as psychologists, we believe we can unlearn these tapes. I believe you can unlearn those tapes that have been created in you. The challenge is to be aware of where they came from, how they've been embedded in the context of behaviors, impulses, instincts that we rely on, that protect us, that justify us, that cause us to justify violence for each other, towards each other, for the sake of protection or threat, as we're hearing from the other speakers. Because we ourselves have not experienced this threat, perhaps, because you have not experienced these realities, doesn't mean they don't exist. I attend these meetings in mental health, downtown, the inner city. I work with a number of populations. I was just recently at a meeting where I was listening to a mental health inner city advocate, and she was expressing the need for safety homes, I thought she said, for the youth of her community, the inner city youth. But I wasn't really listening to her carefully. She wasn't talking about safety homes. She was talking about safe holes, safety holes where kids could jump in when there was danger and risk that they had to survive it on a daily basis. I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in that kind of reality. I choose not to, and I have the power not to. We all have the power to effectively change this, to effectively influence the lifestyle of living in bunkers in order to protect ourselves. As a psychologist, I do think I am very hopeful that we can learn and listen from each other's experience, allowing the opportunity to recognize the shared responsibility we all have to, as students, faculty, and staff at Pepperdine, to share our world of safety and privilege at Pepperdine. I also believe I have the responsibility and to impact and create opportunities in my lifetime where these injustices and inequalities can and must be changed for the better for all. I encourage you to do the same, and not to remain an observer, but to become a proactive person in creating social change that is becoming necessary to truly offer all communities of safety, and not just bunkers to seek shelter from the storm. Thank you.
So first, I'd like to thank everyone who worked to put this event together, the faculty, and all of you, the audience, for being here tonight. Our history as a nation is stained by the dark reality that there was a time when black folks were made to believe that they had no God, no identity, and no rights. The chains around them and the whips behind them continually reminded them that they were less than human. But that was slavery, and that's gone now, they say. A discussion of racism is dated, they claim. Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement, that happened. That's in the past. We've progressed, right? Yet here we are discussing a national tragedy that has led to massive public distress. Because once again, a young black man was taken from his family much too early. I believe, and I'm sure most of you have heard, that Jesus came 2,000 years ago, died, and rose again on a cross. That was actually a long time ago. And yet we still go to church, we still preach, we still pray, we still fast, do all of those things. The same logic that we use to ignore racism, if applied to Christianity, would ask us to hang our crosses and put our Bibles down. After all, the greatest victory for all of humanity already happened, right? But instead, we think that, and we are accustomed to this idea that it is socially acceptable to ignore the cries and the tears of a community that has been historically, empirically, and disproportionately victimized. It's not acceptable, and we need to move away from this. We can no longer be tolerant of a world in which the very ignorance, disbelief, and hate that tear us at the seams continues to tear us at the seams of our American identity. Now, Ferguson was not an isolated event. There are other incidents that are like that. However, we seem to ignore that those exist. There are disparities in our legal system that they affect the least among us. Blacks and Hispanics are imprisoned at rates that have led individuals like Angela Davis to say that this is the new wave of Jim Crow. And in fact, the people that are in prison today are more than have ever been enslaved. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People says that if we were to stop those trends, the population would fall by 50%. The stark reality is that if we don't do that, if we don't stop those trends, 1 in 3 black baby boys can expect to spend time in prison during their lifetime. And that's a number that I'm not okay with living with. Now, you may draw your own conclusions. And in fact, many students, when discussing race, will say things like, well, I don't see it. It's not around me. But I would urge you to not define the way that others live and the way that the world works merely based on your own bubble or your own life experience. Instead, I would say that you need to expand your horizon as a student. You need to be able to go research. I promise, a Google search engine is not that hard. If you type in any of these things, plenty of stuff is going to come up. And by doing that, we can better address these questions and better understand what it is that we're facing and what it is that we need to do. And I'll end by addressing a question that was posed in response to my recent article in the graphic about Ferguson. This person asked me if I would label a surfer abusive for defending themselves from a shark. But for me, the question is irrelevant in a world in which we already assume who's the surfer and who's the shark. I hope to live in a world where, as for myself, I hope to live in a world where black folks are not dehumanized to the level of sharks, but rather given the dignity to be seen as more than always violent and always wrong. Thank you.
I'd like to look at racial discrimination and in particular racial segregation in this country, which I would argue, at least sociologically and economically, is really at the root of much of racial inequality. So first of all, the extent of racial segregation, especially for African Americans, according to the 2010 census, roughly 59% of urban African Americans live in segregated neighborhoods, meaning that 59% of urban African Americans would have to move to another area of town in order to achieve racial integration, or in order for sociologists to assume that they had gone there voluntarily. On top of that, roughly 30% or a third of African Americans in the country live in what's known as hypersegregation, meaning that there are virtually no whites that live anywhere near them. So when I was in graduate school, a friend of mine said he was African American from New York. He said he was 12 before he met his first white person in person, right? He saw them on television, but he never actually knew any. Still, over time, trends are very mildly encouraging. So from 1980 until 2010, the dissimilarity index for African Americans dropped from 73%, meaning that 73% were segregated, down to 59%. So maybe in 300 years, we'll achieve something like equality. Okay, so what are the causes? First of all, the cause of segregation of African Americans is not voluntary. So African Americans are not choosing to live in particularly segregated neighborhoods. When we do public opinion polling of African Americans, they overwhelmingly say that they would strongly prefer to live in an integrated neighborhood. It's also not primarily from lower income itself, although there is a strong correlation between race and class. Actually, only 10% of racial segregation of African Americans can be explained statistically by class, by income. Instead, what's going on are a number of fairly ugly things that sometimes you only see the results of, and unless you're sort of studying in depth, you don't necessarily see the sort of causes. So one is white flight. Most whites will live in a neighborhood if a significant number of African Americans move in. Some range. So the range of the most intolerant area would be 3%. So 3%, above 3%, all the whites will leave. Others are more tolerant, and they'll go up to 20%. But after 20%, almost all whites will leave a neighborhood if African Americans start moving in. Next, racial violence. This is historically how many of the northern ghettos were segregated. So if an African American family moves into a predominantly all-white neighborhood, then whites sometimes do charming things such as burn crosses in their front yard, beat them up, and occasionally murder them. And this continues even at very small levels to this day. And this is, again, how many of the original areas were created. Then discrimination by real estate agents. This is very prominent. So they refuse to show a house in a predominantly white area if the couple is African American, and you can demonstrate it by pair study. So one African American couple, one white couple go to the same realtor and see what happens. Next, discrimination by property owners. So they refuse to rent to minorities, and I have personal stories I could tell you about that. Exclusionary zoning, so suburban areas are zoned or deliberately zoned a particular area for expensive houses only 3-car garages, and again, because of the correlation between race and class, especially in particular metropolitan areas, the effect is to keep out many working class African Americans. Also, public housing and urban renewal quote. So urban renewal at the beginning on paper was to sort of get rid of dilapidated housing and so on, make the neighborhood better. In fact, in most cases, urban renewal is basically taxpayer-funded ethnic cleansing of African Americans, and not simply in the South. Next, redlining. So insurance companies and private banks deliberately go around on a map and they draw something like, even historically, a red line around a neighborhood which is predominantly African American, and say, we will not insure this area, we will not give loans in this area. So regardless of the income of the particular applicant. Technically, this is illegal since 1968 in the Fair Housing Act, but it still continues because the enforcement of civil rights laws in housing basically non-existent, really a lack of will. Finally, restrictive covenants, so there are clauses in sales contracts which forbade the owner to sell to African Americans, other groups that were not favored, so Native Americans, Chinese, sometimes even Armenians. It would read something like, and furthermore, no lot shall be sold to, leased to, or occupied by any person accepting of the Caucasian race. Technically, it's not legally enforceable in the United States since 1948, but the effects remain, and there's still a sort of a, quote, gentleman's agreement that if you sell, we sell this to you, it's on the understand that you will sell it to the, quote, right people, meaning people of the, quote, right race. Okay, so the effects of segregation, one, you tend to have higher unemployment rates among people who live in segregated neighborhoods because the jobs are increasingly in the suburbs, with African Americans who are living in the center cities, and then politicians are able to neglect the services and the infrastructure and schools and policing and so on because the people with political power don't live there.
Mike Brown's America, Race Policing, and the Value of Black Life. One of my favorite quotes is from a theologian by the name of William Stringfellow. And he says that we must learn to read America biblically and stop reading the Bible Americanly. And when I think about that, it points me to what is part of what I believe is part of the arrogance of our modern society. It's not merely in thinking that we have addressed the race issue, as quite often seen in the ideology of colorblindness, but it's in thinking that we are free to address the race issue. We should ask the question of whether we are free to address the race issue. In fact, racism and its surrogates of militarism and materialism, King called them the three triplets, are so much a part of the fabric of our conditioning that we have to ask the question about our freedom to address this issue. It's so interwoven into our consciousness. In fact, what this says about Ferguson is that the response in Ferguson is not the result of politicization. It is the result of a kind of conscientization. It was unplanned, it was unpremeditated, and it was visceral when you look at the response in Ferguson. The killing of Mike Brown galvanized that community. And the question we should ask ourselves is whether a political solution is the first step in addressing the problem, or is the first step is in decolonizing of our own consciousness. We have to think deeply about this issue in terms of how politicization, in fact, in America, is quite often stereotyped, superficial, and it always ends in a stalemate. And so one of the things that we can learn from Ferguson, if we pay close attention to it and see their conscientization, is we might get a glimpse of our own way of coming alive to the problems in America. And thirdly, and I'll say this in conclusion, that we must remember that when you see the issue in Ferguson, this is not merely a question of the value of black life. This is a question of the value of all of our lives in America. How do we find freedom to address these issues? And there are some choices. The great piece on colonization by Mary Cesare. In one of the places he reads that when we can no longer justify ourselves at the bar of reason or at the bar of conscience, that nations will often result to hypocrisy. And hopefully we will move beyond that choice.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to take an opportunity to just echo everyone's thanks and to note the historic nature of this. I've never, ever seen professors talk for less than 5 minutes, so let's appreciate that fact. Well done, Dan. You scared us half to death, apparently. So I see this as an opportunity, really, and I'm so grateful to be part of this. I see this as an opportunity for us to practice loving the Lord our God with all our minds, soul, heart, and strength, and to think about how we can treat our neighbors as ourselves. So I'm very glad to be part of this. I'm a political scientist, and I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to try to provide some context for us today for these conversations by talking about the different ways that black Americans and white Americans experience and perceive government. They're very different, and they're different in ways that I would have had no idea when I was sitting where you are. I grew up in a very white rural area in Michigan, and so I'm still learning, and I appreciate the fact that we can learn together today. So politics is sometimes defined as who gets what, when, where, and how. There's lots of evidence that shows that black Americans get considerably less from government than white Americans in terms of what they want. I'll give you two examples. One has to do with who gets elected. There are a number of studies that demonstrate that black Americans are significantly less likely to see their preferred candidate win elections compared to white Americans. That's true over a 30-year time period. That's true for presidential elections, Senate elections, gubernatorial elections, and mayoral elections. And in fact, one study found that 49% of African Americans saw their preferred candidate lose in all four levels of government. 49% of black Americans compared to 9% of white Americans that were in that unfortunate category. In addition, this is a second example, black Americans are less likely to see their preferred policies enacted by government. There are a number of studies that show this. There's one that's ongoing right now that's looking at lots of different groups, different racial and ethnic groups, income groups, education groups, sex groups, religious groups. The one category that consistently is less likely, considerably less likely, to see preferred policies enacted into law is black Americans. If we look at this more or less objective evidence, it appears that for black Americans, democracy is more often a losing proposition. Not surprisingly, black Americans view the system in considerably less positive terms than white Americans. When asked, do you trust the government to do what's the right thing most of the time? Black Americans are considerably less trusting of the government compared to whites. Black Americans are also more likely to agree with the following two statements. Public officials don't care much. Public officials don't care much what people like me think. People like me don't have a say in what government does. So the political system looks considerably less helpful, more negative to black Americans than to white Americans. That's saying something because white Americans don't think it's all that great anyway. So the political system, we view it in different ways. Different groups view it in different ways. That's also true of the criminal justice system. I'll just highlight a few points on this. There are many studies that demonstrate that if there's a white person that is convicted of a crime and a black person that's convicted of the same crime, the punishment, the sentence for the black individual will be much more punitive. We've already talked about differences, racial differences in incarceration rates. There are racial differences and disparities in terms of policing. There are a number of cities, over 400 cities in the United States, where the police department is significantly more white than the community that they're policing. Two examples of this. One is Maple Heights, Maple Heights, Ohio, where 2/3 of the population of the city is African American and 6% of the police force is black. Another city that's just like that is Ferguson, Missouri, where 65% of the population is comprised of black Americans and 8% of the police force is black. Not surprisingly, black Americans view the law enforcement establishment in considerably more negative terms. I'll give you just two examples of this and then I'll sit down. When asked generally, do you think of police more as friends or enemies? More as friends or enemies? Whites, 49% of whites say more as friends. 23% of African Americans say more as friends. And finally, the most eye-opening thing for me, here's a question. Was there ever a specific instance when you felt discriminated against by the police because of your racial and ethnic background? 7% of whites said yes. 45% of black Americans responding to the survey said yes. The different groups that make up the United States, white Americans, black Americans in particular, we see government in distinctly different terms. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. This is kind of low. Okay. Well, I'm Joshua Gray. It's an honor to be here, and I thank everybody who is here, who came out, and everybody who put this together. I just want to share a few of my experiences, enlightening you guys to what I may go through. I'm a black man, well, obviously. Mike Brown was a black man as well. I'm 6'4". Mike Brown was supposedly 6'4" as well. I have a world of opportunities in front of me. I have blessings to embrace. Mike Brown would have had blessings to embrace and opportunities to take advantage of. However, Mike Brown is evidently not here today to tell you his America. However, I share a few experiences that might give you a glimpse to what his America was like. A little bit about me. I'm from Las Vegas. I'm in elementary school. I didn't grow up in a predominantly black neighborhood. However, I had black friends, white friends, Hispanic friends, and so much more. And it was an honor to really have that ethnic diversity. But in middle school, once again, I had black friends, white friends, Hispanic friends. It was a huge, huge diverse friend group. However, I got a glimpse to what this culture is like, the culture that I may embrace one day. And that is where great, great struggles may attack academic prominence. And then I go to high school and I go to college and I become the only one. In many classes, many environments, I'm the only black individual in that setting. That's one of my experiences. That is my America. And on a personal level, my whole life I've been conditioned to expect and embrace a welcoming and appreciative culture, conditioned to welcome and embrace all races and ethnicities. I was conditioned to carry myself upright and righteous in an effort to better my image in the public and in public spaces. That way I don't draw any additional criminal suspicion. Although I was conditioned to expect such social dynamics and carry myself with poise, does not eliminate the fact that racial profilings exist, racial insensitivities exist and are committed, and the value of my life is questioned. My dad always told me to not wear your hoodie around in stores because you might bring additional criminal suspicion, not to do anything suspicious because you're black and you might draw that extra suspicion. Or 2 weeks ago, being followed in 7-Eleven because I was the only black person in there, hypothetically. And furthermore, here at Pepperdine, racial misunderstandings are real and racial offenses are real. The use of the N-word fearlessly by black communities and non-black communities occur. A fellow wave being called the N-word here on campus happens. Walking off of sidewalks because I'm walking in your direction. I'm not a shark, so it's not necessary. Assuming that I love Roscoe's because of the color of my skin. Or even sometimes being followed in a cab by a particular worker in fear that I may steal something. Racial offenses are real. Racial misunderstandings are real. Miscalculating the worth of the black life is real in America. These realities characterize my America and possibly characterize Mike Brown's America. So I'm grateful for quality and constructive conversations such as this Mike Brown's America, because we're able to vulnerably share our experiences and our realities with others who have not experienced those realities. Thank you.
I cannot believe we're on time. Miracles happen, people. Miracles happen. I'm going to cue up this PowerPoint, but while I do, I want us all to give our speakers one more round of applause. Thank you all for being here. Let me also thank the following people and organizations that made this happen. Thanks to Dr. Emily Scott Lowe and Tabitha Jones Jolivet. Tabitha is our awesome timekeeper, and boy, you cracked the whip, Tabitha. Way to go. Dr. Scott Lowe, who will be helping us out in a second. The Intercultural Affairs Office, Dr. Carrie Inge and Bryce Cofield. Sarah Jaggard from the Convocation Office was a valued partner. Sarah Barton, our new university chaplain. Thank you so much, Sarah. And the Social Science Division. Now, we have extra time, which is awesome because I know you want to get to the dialogue. So let me pull up just briefly this slide. If you'd like to continue to these discussions, Dr. Jolivet, Dr. Newman, and Dr. Scott Lowe will be in Plaza Classroom 188. Dr. Dan Caldwell, Dr. Ray Carr, and Tabitha Jones Jolivet in 189, and Dr. Tomas Martinez and myself in Plaza Classroom 190. I'm going to go ahead and ask our panelists to get a head start going in that direction, and if we can all just thank you so much for being here. Thanks for taking the time. Please join us in the Plaza Classrooms. We're going to have some great dialogue. So thanks again very much, and go in peace.